today we're going to talk about the science of psychology, which is basically just an intro right now into psychology. So, first, we're going to start with psychology and common misconceptions. So, basically, psychology is a scientific study of behavior and mental processes, which we also have theories. This explains why and how behaviors occur. It basically helps summarize facts and organize research on specific things. But it's important to note these are grounded in facts and evidence. You can't just make any thought a theory, and it's also not applicable to all people whatsoever. Parts of it might apply, but parts of it also might not. Another thing we have in psychology is a confirmation bias. So, this is basically our tendency to interpret people's behavior in a way that actually supports our expectations. So, another way to consider this is picking up evidence along the way that confirms a belief we have to be true, and then disregarding any evidence that challenges our conclusion or makes us reconsider our worldview. They're basically great at creating order and structure for us amidst chaos. You'll actually see this a lot in relationships. People could say, you know how much this upsets me, so of course you behave this way because you don't care about me. Or, of course you forgot to respond to my text because you don't respect me. It's very dangerous because you're obviously overlooking outliers or exceptions to these expectations, and you're not really looking at anything that can dissuade this false narrative you're responding to. Another thing we have is pseudopsychology. So this is information or conclusions that sound scientific, but they actually haven't been tested using the scientific method. So you actually see this a lot nowadays with influencers who speak quote unquote words of wisdom based on their personal views, but present it as founded in scientific evidence, or they'll finagle things to fit their opinions and views. Some examples are phrenology, like some people claim the shape of your skull actually indicates your personality traits because somehow it reflects that the form of your brain influences brain development. Or another example too is numerology. There's a relationship between how numbers appear in our lives and things that happen to us. And the numbers are symbolic and have energy and influence your life. And then lastly, we have critical thinking. Basically, it's your thought process we use to analyze and evaluate information to apply it to other situations. It's basically like healthy skepticism in psychology. You do not take what you are presented at face value. Instead, you try to ask questions and analyze other perspectives. So next we'll get into the scientific method. So goals, hypothesis, methods, and all of that. Basically, with the scientific method, it's a process we use to test hypotheses, or what we call ideas. And the goals of it are four: describe, predict, explain, and then control or change behavior. Basically, the describing part is you're observing events and you're basically describing them to see how they are related. So maybe a counselor notices a clients who present with symptoms of depression also tend to have stress. So then the next step would be predicting, using what you described or observed to predict what will happen. So that counselor who observed clients with depression also tend to have stress might now predict that clients who come see them and have stress may be more prone to experiencing depression. So they prepare by having certain questions and assessments readily available to assess for depression. So then you go into explaining. Even though events can regularly occur together, they don't actually know sort of what causes certain behaviors. So stress may not be the exact cause of depression. Though related, we don't necessarily know what causes the other. So it's also the fact that behavior associated with depression could be due to something else. Maybe it's environment, a loss, contextual factors, underlying health or mental health condition. But once you've got all of that, you can then try to control or change behavior. But to do so, you have to fully understand, what's explaining certain behavior so you can actually modify those things. So let's say stress is a factor that contributes to or causes depression. Well, then we need to understand what specifically is happening in that regard to control symptoms and promote change. So maybe the client could be experiencing depression as struggling to get out of bed, eat, keep up with basic hygiene, they're falling behind in school and work. So knowing what's exactly the cause of all of this can help us know what do we got to do to treat the symptoms and promote change. But then there are hypotheses, which basically an hypothesis is, like we said, an idea or an educated guess, essentially. So part of hypotheses, though, are variables. They're conditions or factors or characteristics that can vary, or they can also be manipulated or changed, but that depends on the experiment you're doing. So two types of hypotheses you'll commonly see are predictive and causal hypotheses. Predictive hypotheses are those educated guesses, but they're geared towards the relationship between variables or factors. So basically, the goal of these ones is to address the description and prediction phase of the process. So you're not controlling or manipulating any variables. All you're doing is observing what's happening, making some predictions, and then you state what was observed, but you can't really draw a cause and effect conclusion. Causal hypotheses are a bit different. They are the educated guess, but it's more about how one variable will influence another variable. And these can only be tested through experiment because they're actually trying to determine the cause of a behavior. So the variables are actually manipulated and changed. And a lot of times you'll state how one variable impacts or causes a change in another variable. So an example of a predictive hypothesis is college students who get more sleep perform better on exams. If you make that into a causal hypothesis, you're saying college students who get 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night perform better on exams than students who get less than 7 hours of sleep per night. So basically, you have the variables of sleep and exam performance. One is just kind of making observations and making predictions, where another is actually looking at how can we manipulate some variables to see how it impacts exam performance. We also have some methods, so participants and samples. First, you gotta select your participants you want to study. You wanna identify what we call the population of interest. That is animals or people. Basically, maybe you wanna study the impact of alcohol on adults. So your population of interest could be adults ages 21 and older who regularly consume alcohol, which would be at least 3 times a week. Then you select a sample or a part of the population of interest used for your study. So you kind of need to figure out where you'll get this sample of people from and how they'll represent and fit your population of interest. But you have a few options. You have what we call a representative sample. So that is a sample that represents your population of interest as much as possible. The more representative, the more the results will apply. You also have random samples. So basically, every member of the population, that is every person on this planet age 21 and older who regularly consumes alcohol, has an equal chance of being selected to participate in your study, which helps reduce any sort of biases being present, but that is kind of hard to do. You could use online platforms that allow you to recruit a vast array of participants. That is one option, but again, random samples can be rather difficult. A lot of times what happens is convenience sampling, so groups of people who are easily accessible are chosen for the study. So basically, your sample could be pulled from a university or a community or a specific state. The catch, though, is it might not always be super representative. It's only representative of a very specific person from a very specific place. And it's important to note, Research being done online. Not all online research is representative. Someone may not have access to the internet. People can falsify information. Some people get distracted, and so forth. So next we have our research methods, so how we can conduct certain research at times. The first one is naturalistic observations. So this is research that's conducted in an environment where the behavior you're studying typically occurs. You're not controlling variables. All you're doing is just observing behaviors and making predictions. However, you do need to be aware of reactivity. That's where participants will behave differently because they're aware you're actually observing them. The book gives a great example of a naturalistic observation. Researchers looked at how dual earner families interact after work. So that's basically both parents who work, they come home, how are they interacting? And they saw that mothers and fathers were both greeted with positive behavior, but the moms spent more time with children and the fathers spent more time alone. You also have case studies. These are very in-depth, specific observations. Again, you're not controlling variables. You're really just observing behaviors. An example of this is a girl named Jeannie Wiley. She was actually raised in social isolation. She was locked in a bedroom, isolated, and actually abused for more than a decade. And they did a case study where they took an in-depth look into language development and how nature, genetics versus nurture, the environment, play a role in this because she was so severely behind in her language development. Another example is Phineas Gage. He was a man who survived an accident where a metal rod went through his frontal lobe. And the study took an in-depth look into behavioral changes after brain damage. And then the last one is surveys. So it's a method that asks a large group of people about attitudes, beliefs, and or behaviors. They're just taking a survey. And what you're doing here is you're making predictions and then you're testing out hypotheses. So who you ask and how you ask are important because of biases, especially because you want to make sure everyone's understanding the survey prompts correctly. I'm actually using a survey in the research I've conducted regarding identity development, intimacy, and responsibility. But to help reduce biases, I'm making sure the surveys or assessment instruments I'm using are backed by years of research so that they are valid. Another research method you can use is a correlational study. Basically, a correlational study tests a relationship between two variables. The variables are not controlled. All you're doing is predicting behavior. You're not drawing a cause and effect conclusion. But what you look at is what we call correlational coefficient. So this is a statistic that tells you how strong a relationship between variables is. So the closer to 1, it could be positive or negative, the stronger the relationship or correlation is. The closer to 0, the weaker the correlation. So a positive correlation is an increase in one variable corresponds to an increase in another variable. But that means the number you're getting is a positive number. A negative correlation means an increase in one variable corresponds to a decrease in another variable. In that instance, you're getting a negative number. So a positive correlation example would be as stress increases, so does blood pressure. As sugar intake increases, so does risk for diabetes. A negative correlation example would be as relationship satisfaction increases, depression decreases. As exercise increases, the risk for heart disease decreases. The only catch is correlation does not mean causation. So there could be a third-party variable at play causing an outcome. So maybe a person's increasing their exercise, but their risk for heart disease hasn't decreased. So at that point, are there other genetic components or another health concern at play? Like, why isn't the heart disease decreasing? The next research method we have are experiments. Experiments are the only research method that can test what we called a causal hypothesis, because that is what we use to determine the cause and effect relationship. At this point, we're not really describing or predicting. We are looking to control, modify, change behavior. So necessary features for this are that variables in this instance are being controlled, and participants are assigned to study conditions at random. We'll give some examples as we go through this to help tie it all together, but first we'll start with the variables at play. First, we have an independent variable, which is the cause. This is what we're manipulating and being tested. Next, we have the dependent variable. This is the effect. It's what we're using to help measure the result of manipulating the independent variable. So basically, a way to remember it is dependent variable is dependent upon the independent variable. And we also have confounding variables. These are factors other than the independent variable that can affect the dependent variable, or it can affect the outcome of things. We also have then groups. We have an experimental group, so that's the group that's receiving the manipulation or the manipulated variable being tested. And then you have a control group. This group is not receiving the manipulated variable. It's actually the group you're going to use as a baseline comparison to see kind of what's happening with all the different outcomes. With the control group though, sometimes a placebo effect can happen. The control group is not aware that they are not receiving the manipulated variable. So what can happen is they might believe I'm receiving the manipulated variable, so therefore my behaviors are going to change because they believe whatever treatment is supposedly given to them will have a certain effect. The thing with groups though is you want to make sure they're randomly assigned. So participants are assigned to groups in a way that allows equal chance of being placed in either one. A lot of times nowadays they'll just use different machines to generate who gets assigned where. And the other thing too is you can have double-blind studies. So basically experimenters and participants actually don't know who's receiving what. So everyone's kind of in the dark. It's a free-for-all at that point. But that can be good because it helps reduce biases. So an example of all this would be maybe you're testing a new medication for ADHD that's not a stimulant, because stimulants are a very common medication given. So you're hypothesizing this new medication will improve focus. So what you do then is focus is the dependent variable and the medication is the independent variable. A way to think of it is focus is dependent upon the medication and the medication is what is being controlled. Another way to think of this is that the medication is what is being manipulated to see how it impacts focus. You then have your groups. The experimental group is a group receiving the medication, while the control group does not receive the medication. But again, the control group does not know they're not receiving the medication, so you could have a placebo effect going on. And then your confounding variables could be age, sex, medication use. Maybe they're using medications in their day-to-day life. And these things could possibly have an impact on everything. So you want to make sure these variables are pretty constant throughout your whole population of interest. So study outcomes won't be fully attributed to those things. The other thing you can do is a quasi-experiment where basically participants aren't randomly assigned to different conditions and you're using pre-existing groups. So this isn't really a true experiment. An example of this is studying the effects of COVID-19 on student performance. The pandemic that occurred was not randomly assigned whatsoever. It happened to many, many people. And you could have confounding variables such as differences in the home environment during lockdown. So there's a lot at play that doesn't allow for you to really give a true experiment. So now we'll just briefly provide an overview of the scientific method. So first, you are defining and describing the issue to be studied, and you'll make a prediction. You then form the hypothesis or educated guess. So you're looking at what's the relationship between two variables, how are they being measured? You'll then choose a research strategy. So What group of people do you want to observe? How can you objectively measure those observations? Where's the study going to be conducted? Who will my participants be? And so forth. Then you conduct the study to test a hypothesis, and you can use a variety of different methods we previously discussed to collect the data and see what the outcomes are. And then you analyze the data, see if it supports or rejects your hypothesis or hypotheses. Basically, you're going to utilize statistics for this. If your results do not support the hypothesis, you can pose a new one, or you can alter the hypothesis. But if the results do support it, the research should actually be replicated by you or another team to further solidify the findings. This is actually really important because you help ensure reliability and consistency over time, situations, and cultures. It's basically you saying this wasn't just a happenstance random thing. Here we have a brief example of the scientific method. You can go over at your own leisure. We already gave a few examples throughout this process, so we'll just go ahead and skip on to the next things, which are ethics of research. With research, there are quite a many rules you have to follow to assure you're doing things legally and ethically compliant. So for that, we have review boards or committees to ensure this. In the United States, we have the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board. So they basically review the research proposals. That way they can ensure your ethical standards are met. If you receive approval, you can move ahead with the research. In other countries, they might use the Human Research Ethics Committees. And then there's also the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, IACUC, and they're basically the committee to review research that's related to animals or non-humans. So some common ethical guidelines when it comes to human research are informed consent, confidentiality, deception, and debriefing. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's some of the most common ones you'll come across. Informed consent is super important because you're basically informing all of your participants of the ins and outs of your study so they can agree to participating. So when you do this, what you'll usually do is describe things like the general purpose of the study, the nature of any treatment they'll receive, if services will or will not be available to them and what that would look like, the methods they're assigned to their groups, if they're receiving compensation for participating, risks or side effects that could be experienced from participating in the study. You're basically going over to that they can withdraw at any time if they like, and if you need to, you can get consent to share their personal data with other researchers, institutions, or entities. You're basically giving them a whole bunch of information so they can make an informed decision on whether it's reasonable for them to participate. The other thing is confidentiality. You cannot share the personal data that was collected from each participant unless they agree to it through written consent or you receive a court order. The results you usually share are anonymous, and you want everything to stay anonymous. The other thing too is deception. Basically, this is where participants are not fully informed about the ins and outs of research because maybe you're afraid if they know everything, they'll change their behaviors and it could alter your outcomes. You only use this when alternative procedures that don't use deception are unavailable, which nowadays is pretty non-existent and rare. An example of this, though, is the Milgram experience of 1963. This person wanted to look at obedience and authority, and he wanted to determine whether a person could hurt others when ordered by an authority figure. So what he did is deceived his participants into believing they were participating in a study on learning rather than obedience. The participants were told they'd be playing the role of a teacher, and they were then introduced to a learner who was actually a paid actor. So the teacher or participant's job was to administer an electrical shock to the learner every time the learner made a mistake in hopes to help them better retain a list of words they were trying to memorize. Realistically, the participant wasn't actually shocking the learner. That's why they got paid actors, so they could pretend they were getting shocked. But the poor participants didn't know this and actually thought they were truly shocking the learner. And they were even encouraged to continue this even when they wanted to withdraw. So of course, it has some ethical concerns because the lack of informed consent actually caused quite a bit of psychological harm to them, and that pressure to continue when they wanted to withdraw, and even the fact that there weren't resources offered after the fact to help them with the psychological harm they endured. So usually, if you do use deception, it has to be ethical. You can't do something like this. But afterwards, you debrief. So you let the participants in on the full nature of the study after everything's been completed. Next, we're going to look at some psychological foundations and perspectives and how they've grown over time. So some foundations in psychology start out with structuralism, which stems from William Wundt. Basically, this person focused on the structure of mental processes. So structuralism basically views mental processes as being created through different elements of experience. That led to what we call introspection. So you are observing your own thoughts, feelings, and sensations. They're kind of the three basic elements of consciousness. And over time, growth occurred to where Margaret Washburn, she was the first woman to earn a doctorate in psychology, started studying connections between motor movement, mind, and she also researched animal behavior. So first we'll look at the medical, functional, and evolutionary perspectives in psychology. The medical perspective is really the biological perspective. You're looking at how genetics and the nervous system impact your behavioral and mental process. This is part of the neuroscience field. So a lot of times in the biological side of things, you might use an electroencephalograph to record electrical activity in the brain, or a PET scan to see what part of the brain has increased activity, which can help you understand how certain parts of the brain respond to certain bodily processes and movements. You also have the functional perspective. This is looking at how behavior helps people adapt to their environment. William James created this, and he really believed that consciousness and thought evolved through natural selection. So only organisms best suited to their environment tend to survive and reproduce. A modern day example of this is maybe you believe that driving drunk is harmful, so you adapt your behavior and refrain from doing so. You can also see this a lot in therapy, where therapists try to seek out the purpose or function or survival value of a behavior to understand why it's important. The only catch is in therapy, you actually try to change those because they usually tend to be harmful. The other one is evolutionary perspective. So you're looking at how evolution and natural selection influence behavior. So usually behaviors that increase your chance of survival are actually selected over those that decrease your chance of survival. So an example could be our innate fear of certain animals or experiences actually are possibly a survival mechanism, or empathy allowed for greater connection and well-being. Or maybe preferences towards certain foods might be an evolutionary adaptation that helps us store energy-rich foods. Another one is maybe you find attractiveness in a partner because those qualities increase your chance of survival, or they might be qualities you want to pass down to future generations. Other perspectives you have are the unconscious and environmental perspectives. With unconscious, it starts with psychoanalytic theory, which was created by Sigmund Freud, and that really looks at how our unconscious desires and conflicts influence our behavior. So a lot of times with this, you're looking at the fact that humans are like animals because we hold sexual and aggressive instincts that motivate behavior, but they become repressed so we can be viewed positively by others. So at that point, it becomes an unconscious motive or desire in us. And the conflict between these basically helps us understand human behavior. This does lead to psychodynamic perspective, which looks at how internal, often unconscious mental processes, motives, and desires, or even childhood conflicts explain our behavior. With this one, a lot of times you're looking at how behaviors and unconscious expression of powerlessness and lack of control, which all children actually face, even as adults sometimes. So some people may lie or manipulate to get what they want, but it may be a way to unconsciously express a sense of powerlessness. An example is therapy. You might do inner child work, which is basically you explore your childhood, how it influences your present thoughts, feelings, and behaviors while actively healing your child's past wounds. We then have behaviorism, which is part of the environmental perspective. This really focuses on studying observable stimulus or stimuli, responses, and consequences. Stimulus is object or event perceived by our senses. A response is a reaction to the stimulus or even stimuli. And then you have consequences. What happens after a response? It could be positive, it could be negative. Example of this one is a man named Watson conditioned an infant to fear a rat that they initially had no fear of. He basically did two things. He played a loud noise and then presented the rat, and eventually the infant associated those two stimuli together and therefore feared the rat because they feared the loud noise first. This leads to social cultural perspective, which focuses on societal and cultural factors and how they influence our behavior. It basically says our behaviors learned and understood through culture, identity, gender, and ethnicity. You'll see actually in the United States we have issues with anxiety and depression. So research has attributed this to social media use, individualism, lack of community, and our incessant focus on work. We also have behavioral perspectives. That focuses on external environment, so behaviors learned and influenced by people and events. So maybe you receive positive feedback when you perform well in school by getting a B or higher, or you receive positive feedback when you win a game. So that motivates you to study more or train harder for the next time. The opposite could occur. You get lower than a B or lose a sports game, and you don't see enough of a reward to actually study or train for the next time. Other perspectives include the humanistic, cognitive, and positive perspectives. So humanistic perspective starts with humanism, which looks at personal growth and potential. It basically says we all have inner resources to grow and develop. We have a free will to choose, and the goal is really to use these aspects to help us lead better lives. And it leads to what we have called the humanistic perspective. Our view of ourselves in the world influences our behaviors. So basically, your behavior stems from choice and free will and is influenced by self-concept and self-esteem. Now, self-concept is how you think about yourself, and self-esteem is how you feel about yourself. If you think you are not good at cooking or feel unworthy of someone's kindness, you may not try cooking new recipes or struggle to accept someone wanting to help you. Now, a cognitive perspective focuses on how mental processes, or what we call cognitions, influence our behavior. And this really is just cognitions like reasoning, problem solving, beliefs, and expectations. How do those influence what we do in life? So someone with anxiety may view the world very differently than someone without anxiety and respond accordingly. Such as maybe someone with anxiety has an irrational fear of driving, so they totally avoid it because it's bad, it's horrible, and they believe it will cause them to die. Where someone without that anxiety might view driving as just a normal daily thing and have a very minimal fear of it and engage in it. You also have positive psychology, so that looks at factors that contribute to happiness, positive emotion, and well-being. And then there's an eclectic approach. You basically combine several or more of all the perspectives we talked about to gain a more in-depth approach to explaining human behavior. Now, there are some specialties in psychology. Some of the most common ones you hear about are neuroscience, clinical psychology, forensic psychology, counseling. There's quite a few. So if you're interested in any of them, definitely research them and check them out. We also have the aspects of gender and ethnicity in psychology. Early on, women and minorities were not allowed to receive graduate degrees. Nowadays, we can. So the field's much more dominated by women than men, and there's many more racial and ethnic backgrounds, but it is important to note minorities are still underrepresented. So there are some prominent female figures in psychology. Just to name one, you have Mary Calkins, first female president of the American Psychological Association, and she studied memory. And some prominent figures in psychology also include Francis Sumner. He was the first African American to receive a doctorate in the US. He was coined the father of African American psychology, and he really worked to disprove that African Americans were inferior to white individuals. We also have training in psychology. Typically, you can do a bachelor's, master's, or doctorate. You get to choose how far you want to go. Bachelor's degree is usually 4 years. Master's is anywhere from 2 to 3 years, plus any post-graduation requirements and exams that might be applicable to licensure. And then your doctorate's degree alone is an additional 4 to 7 years. So with your bachelor's degree, you're pretty limited in what you can do. You're in a very entry-level role, so you can work in business, healthcare, and social services, but you're not really assessing or treating clients or even conducting research. You're much more of a supportive role. Now, if you get your master's degree, depending on what you get it in, dictates what you can do, but some common things are a licensed clinical social worker, licensed mental health counselor, or licensed marriage and family therapist. And in this role, you are usually actively treating clients, or you're doing advocacy work if you're a clinical social worker. And then your doctorate degree, again, it depends on the degree. It dictates what you do, but you can get a PhD, a Doctor of Philosophy, and that highly focuses on research, or a PsyD, a Doctor of Psychology, which focuses a lot on clinical training. But in both, you can teach, treat clients, conduct assessments, and also conduct research. I will say in the US, if you're wanting to be a professor of counseling students in a master's program, you usually need a PhD in counselor education. And that has reached the end of our lecture. Thanks, guys.